Mail service is becoming slower, more expensive, and less reliable. So says a new study just published by the Cato Institute and written by our dialogue guest today, Mr. James Bovard. Now, Mr. Bovard is an investigative journalist who contributes regularly to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And he's been writing about the Postal Service since 1978. Welcome to Dialogue, and thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
First, let's talk about the Cato Institute, what it is, and why this study was done on the U.S. Postal Service.
The Cato Institute is a free market think tank. It studies ways that government regulation and programs lower the quality of life in America. Mm-hmm. This study on the Postal Service was done because I was concerned about how much slower my mail was getting, how much more expensive it was becoming, and why it was taking 2 days to mail a letter from Washington, D.C. to Arlington.
Mm-hmm. So it was really a personal motivation then on your part to start the whole thing rolling.
Very much.
What were some of the findings of your study on the quality of mail service provided by the U.S. Postal Service?
Well, since 1969, the first-class mail delivery slowed 15% or 10%. A lot of the innovations the Postal Service has attempted in the last 15 years have been dismal failures. Their electronic mail system was a disaster. They recently thrown the towel on that last August. They have an international electronic mail system that they had to spend $100 for each dollar that they made. Their 9-digit zip code is probably going to be a failure. Almost everything the Postal Service has tried to do to innovate has been a failure.
Mm-hmm. How did you come about with these findings? How did you do your research to find the statistics you just told us there?
Well, I used a lot of elbow grease for one thing. Went back to a lot of government reports, General Accounting Office reports, reports from Congress, hearings before House committees, private reports. There was a report by Doubleday and Company that found that the Postal Service lost 8% of all third-class mail. It just vanished somewhere in the Postal Service, which is pretty amazing. There were a lot of private mail tests on the speed of first-class mail delivery. The Miami News did a test and found that only 63% of the first-class mail met the Postal Service's standards of delivery. It took 7 days for letters to get from Miami to New York.
Okay, why can't private companies deliver first-class mail to U.S. customers? What's keeping them from doing it?
Well, because they'll spend 6 months in prison if they do. It's a federal crime to provide better mail service than the U.S. government. The private express statutes prohibit any competition for the government mail monopoly, and that's the primary reason the Postal Service is expensive, inefficient, and incorrigible.
Mm-hmm. Now, but another question again, why haven't or hasn't the U.S. Postal Service updated their services and reduced their rates? They keep talking about that they have done these things and they use electronic mail, and that apparently you say that hasn't helped at all.
Well, it's hard to find. The Washington Post did a good story on electronic mail a few months ago, and they said that something like 70% of all the mail that was being sent, electronic mail, was junk mail, advertising mail for car sales and this and that. The services, electronic service is very poor. It does not guarantee faster mail delivery than first-class service. And it's just the main reason stamps prices are going up, the rates have gone up so much, is because the wages are so high. The Postal Service pays its average postal worker almost $30,000 a year in pay and perks. Mm-hmm. Salaries are completely out of control. There's no reason to pay that kind of wage for that kind of work. Mm-hmm.
What's the primary reason mail service costs are increasing? Is it then, as you mentioned just now, labor?
Wage rates, right, because labor makes up 83% of the budget for the Postal Service. And since they're paying their workers half again or twice as much as they need to pay them, that means that stamp prices are going to be half again or twice what they have to be. Mm-hmm. If there was competition, you have far lower wage rates and far lower stamp rates.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about inflation? Now, it seems to have affected every other part of our lives, from medical costs skyrocketed to just about anything imaginable. Can't the Postal Service take that as part of the reasons for higher costs?
Well, it certainly had a contribution, but if you look at the rate of inflation versus the rate of stamp rate increases, since 1958, stamp rates are up, first-class rates are up 633%. That's about twice as fast as inflation. Since 1981, January 1st, 81, stamp rates are up maybe 43, 44%. Again, that's far faster than inflation. Mm-hmm. So that's really no excuse for them to rise the rates so fast.
What about you and I? What are we doing to hurt or help the post office in its efforts as customers? Are we doing what they asked us to do with our zip codes and that sort of business?
I think 97% of the mail has zip codes, so that there's the Postal Service really cannot pass the buck to its customers as far as problems. Most people, well, there isn't that much most people can do because they're forced by federal law to use the government system.
Okay, the big question now. What do we do?
What do we do? Well, the best thing to do is to change the law to allow private competition for the government mail service. There's no reason not to have more than one postal service in the Washington, D.C. area. For instance, there's no reason why the transport of small envelopes has to be a government function. I'm not saying we have to get rid of the government postal service. I think that we could keep them there and allow them to continue as a fallback service, but there's no reason to keep everybody else out. If we had done the same thing for telephones or telegraphs or any other kind of service, that service, like the Postal Service, would be very slow and very far behind the times.
So let's take an example. New York City apparently has postal deliveries which are less than desirable, we could say. How would one reconstruct the system in New York City to make it work better? Would there be a number of postal companies, or the U.S. Postal Service supported by smaller satellite companies, more or less? How would that work?
Well, there's a Congressman Bill Green, a liberal Democrat from New York City, who's done mail tests, and he's found that only 44% of the mail in Manhattan is delivered the next day, local mail. Terrible service. He's favored a limited exemption from the monopoly for areas like New York City where the Postal Service fails to meet its own standards of delivery. I think that would be an excellent idea. I think what we should do is have a few tests in New York, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere of allowing open competition for mail service. And then, once we see how well that works, open up the system for competition nationwide.
Okay, the argument comes then that what do we do in rural areas, isolated areas? Would private companies be willing to pick up the tab for what would have to be a loss in some rural areas? What happens to their deliveries?
Well, the system we have right now, the nationwide system, people like the letter carriers and the postmasters pat themselves on the back because we've got the same rate for mailing letters across town and across the country. Well, that may seem fine to them, but I see no reason to charge different rates for different levels of service. There's no reason to have the same. The telephone company charges different rates for calls across country and across town, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have different postage rates for different areas. It'd be easy to charge a surcharge for rural delivery, which they used to do before the rural members of Congress pushed through rural free delivery. And I think that would solve the problem. As now stands, people living in the cities are forced to subsidize people living in the country with mail service. And people in the cities are also forced to have lower standards of service in order so that people in Arkansas and Idaho don't have to pay the full cost of the service that they receive.
Well, what about the businesses then that might spring up in a small town, such as in Idaho? Wouldn't that hurt those businesses if people would say, well, I don't want to deal with him. It's going to be costing me this amount of money to deal with him, whereas it costs me this amount of money to deal with somebody in St. Louis or Chicago. How do you answer a question like that? Well,
it's a question of the current system hiding the true costs and wasting economic resources. If the true cost of doing something in Idaho is twice as much as doing something in Chicago, but the Postal Service hides it and makes you and I pay for it out of our higher first-class stamp rates, then that's really not doing anybody any good except the business in Idaho. There's no moral or economic justification for transferring costs like that.
Well, thank you. And any other things you'd like to add that I may have missed in our discussion?
Well, I'd hope that the people can. The labor unions are very powerful. They make a lot of campaign contributions. Congress has been pretty cowardly as far as facing up to the low level of service. But I think if enough people protest loud enough, that Congress will realize they have to loosen up the grip and not make it a federal crime to provide good mail service.
So then what can we as individuals do to change things? Should that be the thing we want to do?
Well, I'd say write letters and calls to your congressman, letters to the editor of the paper. Just somehow make your voice known.
Thanks for joining us today. Our guest today has been Mr. James Bovard, the author of a study on the U.S. Postal Service entitled The Last Dinosaur, the U.S. Postal Service, which is published by the Cato Institute. Tomorrow, our guest will be Mr. Tom Costin, the president of the National Association of Postmasters. And this is John Chester for Dialogue.